Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. We've spoken a few times recently about the business opportunities within the shift to renewables and the push to hit our net zero targets. One of those opportunities that just keeps coming up is carbon capture and storage, and already we're seeing deals being done in that space. This month, ASX-listed nanotechnology company Dotz Nano, D-O-T-Z Nano, N-A-N-O, signed an agreement to acquire technology that uses plastic waste to capture and store CO2. The chair of Dotz Nano is a very well-known Australian businessman, Brookes AM. Bernie's got quite the CV, ranging from executive director at Woolworths and CEO of Myer to running other businesses here and overseas, owning his own companies and working with charities like the Salvation Army. Bernie Brookes, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Sean. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
I want to get on to Dotz Nano, but many of us know you from your Myer days. Off air, you said that was 2013. What have you been doing in the subsequent 10 years or so?
So I spent 3 to 4 years over in Africa running the largest retail group there, which was a sort of distressed retail group. And I also, during that time, spent some time in Indonesia and India. But
Right.
more importantly, more recently, I've been purchasing a couple of small accessory and fashion businesses and turning them around and developing them into businesses with the help of a few other ex-Myer and ex-Woolworths people. So it's been a great introduction to small business after all the big businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that in itself is a story. I'm just interested, how do you get into carbon capture and storage and Dotz Nano from that retail pedigree that you have?
Sure. So I'm fascinated by this technology, and I did English and history at university, so I'm not a scientist. But what I did find is fascinating technology, remarkable, and it's based in Israel from a technological point of view, and I think that's pretty much leading edge, and really interested in the advanced carbon-based material technology. So it was right in a sweet spot for me, but one that's a little bit unparalleled with my previous retail work.
Okay, so tell us about Dotz Nano. What is it exactly?
So it's a technology leader that specializes in advanced carbon-based materials, and that material has some fantastic qualities that make it suitable for tracing, anti-counterfeiting, product liability solutions for brands and for manufacturers, advanced security markers, which is sort of an end-to-end solution for everything from lubricants, chemicals, cannabis plants, all giving the opportunity to be traceable. The second part is in the biospace, so what we call Dotz Bio, which is detection of things such as COVID with COVID test kits, and also gene therapy for bioprocessing. And then the part that we're now talking about is what we call Dotz Enhance, which is CO2 capture reduction. So it's a carbon nanosorbent that can absorb CO2 from flue gas, as an example, anti-strokes materials for the self-cooling of buildings and vehicles, and that gives us a great opportunity with the new H2 Blue technology that we've acquired to actually capture and store carbon.
Okay, I feel like I'm a year 6 child in a year 12 physics class or chemistry class here. The actual technology itself, so let's talk about carbon capture and storage, just sort of break that down. So what's the new technology you've acquired and what does it do for my year 6 size chemistry brain here, Bernie, please?
No, that's fine. And remember, I said I was English and history, so I'm a lot easier talking in that space. So it's a proprietary and patented method of converting plastic waste to carbon-based sorbents for the sole purpose of CO2 capture and storage. So in other words, imagine putting some DOTS equipment on top of a flue gas with a lot of carbon coming out of
Carbon
it,
emissions?
CO2 coming out of it, yep. And what it then does is it captures it, creates it with our special sauce into a sorbent, and that sorbent can then be stored in non-recyclable plastic. So it has the double whammy of using non-recyclable plastic, but also storing carbon. And as we know, carbon capture, very topical at the moment. And so it is the next phase from our point of view, and it's backed by a number of world-renowned sort of technologies that I'm sure I can talk about. But it's one of many ways to capture CO2, but it's the way that H2 Blue have developed it, making it more sort of environmentally sustainable, cost-effective, and certainly applicable and scalable going forward throughout the world.
Okay, so I'm just going to keep the analogy going. So you've captured the carbon and it's a sorbent, which means you can literally bury that or inject it into the ground again. That's the storage part of it.
Yeah, you can store it anywhere in any way you want. I mean, it stores in a much more smaller form in the form of a sorbent, and that enables obviously such things as carbon trading as that develops more and more, as well as CO2 capture. It can be released at any time by using amines and also using a heating, but generally it actually captures and takes it away from going into the atmosphere.
Stay with me, Bernie. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Bernie Brookes AM, Chair of Dotz Nano. Okay, now carbon capture and storage is something that we've heard a lot more of. I mean, in fact, the previous coalition government under Tony Abbott, I think, originally spoke a lot about CCS. It kind of went off the radar a bit. More recent times, it has certainly gotten a lot of attention simply because a lot of the big emitters saying unless you do carbon capture and storage, you don't get to net zero eventually, or you don't get to our targets for 2030. How big is the opportunity here?
Yeah, it's enormous. I mean, according to the sort of global CO2 organization, it's nearly a 1.2 trillion opportunity for revenue to reduce CO2 emissions by only 15%. So you can imagine if we wanted to go further than 15%. So if I look at it from let's call it the size of the prize or the financials, it's an enormous opportunity. But and I think the reason it's become a little bit less prevalent in the press and with the governments are that the technology is still at an infancy stage. All carbon capture technologies are still at an infancy stage. And so therefore, we all know it's a 2 to 3 year program, maybe even 5 years, to be able to fully develop and use methods of carbon capture such as this one. And so the long runway is not appealing to a lot of people because I think governments have a short space of time of being in office. So therefore, they're not that attuned to something that has a long tail. But there's an inevitability that this is going to become a very significant part of the future because you said the emitters of large CO2 have a variety of options, but they've got a huge environmental footprint. They've got a lot of emissions, and the only way you can compensate for those is with capture technologies. And so ours has got some unique traits to it that make it very attractive. And there is a lot of interest already by a lot of industrial companies throughout the world.
Okay, just before we leave the role of government in that, the government hasn't put money into carbon capture and storage as yet, and they didn't put anything in the previous budget. The other thing, you said 5 years, but hydrogen technology and all that, that's got a long runway as well. Is it something that we need better cooperation between business and government to get this done, be it CCS or anything else?
Well, I think in signing the French Accord, the scenario is that we've agreed to emissions. And so the problem is the runway to get to those emissions has a variety of ways, the way in which we manage garbage right the way through to the way things are made. But inevitably, there's still got to be a CO2 carbon technology. And my reading from around the world is that there's a lot more advanced support from governments around the rest of the world, and business and government gets together. There's actually a whole association with CO2 carbon capture. And this business, H2 Blue, for example, has already had some government support in Canada with some provision of support to be able to get it off the ground. And Israel government as well has been highly supportive of a lot of industry. So I think if we want to meet the targets that we've got, there's no choice but to capture CO2. And therefore, if the government want to meet that target, then there has to be some involvement from the government in supporting industry to be able to do exactly that.
Is Israel the leader? I mean, Israel technology is kind of second to none in many ways, in many areas at least. Is Israel a leader in this? Where should Australia be looking towards in terms of government and business working together to achieve these sorts of goals?
So this technology was developed by Dr. James Tour of Rice University in the States, and he coincidentally is the founder of Weebit, which is another sort of Australian listed company, and that's also been checked and characterised by what's called Syntef, which is the largest independent research organisation. And so why I mention both Europe and the US is that they're much more advanced in the way forward. And so Israel has become, let's call it the party that brings them together, but the technologies are adopted from and checked from both Europe and the US. And there is an enormous challenge in emitters, particularly in the mid-US, of being able to capture their carbon. And so therefore there's an active interest, in the government have, of course, a system of levy that they call like a tax system that encourages companies to actually capture it. And similarly in Europe, those targets are also can be quite punitive if you don't reach your emission targets. So I think Australia has not yet moved to that phase, but it seems inevitable that this will be the way forward for Australia as well if we want to play a part in the bigger community.
Bernie, while I've got you, I can't not at least ask about retailing and how you see retailing post-COVID. You said you still have interest in some smaller retailers here. How has it changed in the last or post-COVID?
So I've just spent the last sort of month overseas and attending the World Retail Congress, so I can probably answer that with a bit more authority than sort of off the cuff. But I think, firstly, there's no doubt that there is a continued move still to the digital age, and it's reached a point where digital is now as high as sort of 24% in the UK as an example. So the first trend is that continued digital move in Australia and overseas. The second is the ESG component. There's an enormous push for providers of everything from denim to food manufacturers to have an environmental and social consciousness, and we're seeing that. And I think the other change that's taken place is I've just spent the last 2 weeks in China, and an inevitability, the Chinese are certainly hurting as volume comes off from the Northern Hemisphere. And so we're seeing availability of product quite strong now in Australia from China. But generally, retailers are finding a downturn, particularly over the last 2 to 3 months, as the savings rate runs out that we saved tremendously during the period of what was going on with COVID. And then added to that, we had, of course, the government support, and that's run out. And then added to that, of course, we've got the high inflation rate, the cost of energy and mortgage rates. And so therefore, the disposable income is suffering dramatically. And I think all retailers are moving from a positive territory. And I think the majority are now budgeting for negative territory over the next 3 to 6 months. The only exception, of course, is the food guys. And what they're seeing is a down trading to lower cuts of meat and a down trading to what you really would call a generic product. So it's not a particularly good environment. I think the outcome between now and the next 6 to 9 months is going to be very difficult, and I think we will see a lot of stress in that retail sector.
Bernie, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
You're more than welcome.
That was Bernie Brookes AM, Chair of Dotz Nano. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.